I'm going to be presenting a paper that has actually just come out in the inaugural edition of the Transactions on Social Computing. It's been a long journey. It was originally written in 2015, this particular paper, so it's taken until now to actually see the light of day, though it came out on Oxford some time ago in actual fact. So I think people have actually already cited this paper before it even actually managed to appear properly in the journal. But anyway, finally I get to present it. I'm going to be somewhat winging it today because a 43-page journal paper trying to squeeze into a 17-minute presentation is a bit of a challenge. So I shall probably just talk, and then Jackie will tell me to stop at some point in time. So the particular topic I'm going to be talking about actually grew out of a project that I was involved in that ended in March last year called Theme. It was a European project. And the focus of Theme was upon rumours. And in particular, it was interested in how you might be able to use machine learning in order to explore the veracity of rumourous communications in order to provide prompts to various possible user communities. Myself, I was focusing upon journalists and how journalists might use tools like that. But there were various kinds of strands to the project, so it was focusing upon medical communications and things like that as well. The particular project we were working on was focused upon social media streams, and its focus for most of the length of the project was upon Twitter. It did in the very latter stages of the project also look at Reddit, but that was literally in the last few months. So most of the time it was focused upon Twitter. Now, I'm something of an old ethno methodologist, an old ethno, somewhat crusty one, and I had a look right back in the early days of when I was presented with this problem of, well, we're working with Twitter here, and we'd like to figure out something to say about rumours, and we'd like to understand how interaction happens on Twitter and how rumours get spread on Twitter and things like this. So what have you got to say about it? As an ethno, I was sort of reflected upon that a bit. I went out and looked at the literature. Now, the literature I found largely at that point in time, and remember we're going back to 2015 now, I think that the literature has become a little more sophisticated since then, but in 2015, mostly what you found was a lot of reworking of the stuff that happens on Twitter, which is effectively what I would term as standard constructive analytic sociology, which is basically finding the same old themes about all the stuff that people like to talk about, social themes that people like to talk about, race, gender, politics, all of those things reworked on Twitter, and let's see what we can say about what people are doing with that stuff on Twitter. So there were a lot of papers out there about that. There was an awful lot of stuff that was content analysis, so looking at specific features and let's see what we can say about the particular content of tweets and all these features that crop up in all of these tweets all over the place. So there's a lot of that stuff. And there was also some attempts at conversation analysis, where people were trying to actually have a go at seeing what particular features that you find in descriptions of conversation analysis were cropping up in tweets. That latter stuff, I have to say, was a little more sophisticated than the other material, but was still problematic in some ways from my point of view. What I had as my own particular problem was I wanted to understand how microblogging, and in particular how the use of Twitter, was organised as a social phenomenon in its own right. The material I was looking at and seeing at that point in time was not really telling me anything about how Twitter was organised as a phenomenon in its own right. It was telling me about how Twitter was something else, but not how Twitter was Twitter. So I decided at that point in time that I wanted to go back to first principles and think about Twitter a little bit more closely in terms of how it was organised as a phenomenon in its own right. Now, I have to stress here that although the paper is called Microblog Analysis as a Program of Work, it's not really microblog analysis here. It's very much just talking about Twitter, really. And even then, when we talk about Twitter, if I'm absolutely honest, I'm only looking at a very small section of the interactions on Twitter, because I'm talking about conversational engagements, what people call as conversational engagements on Twitter, interactions, exchanges on Twitter that happen between people. But, of course, Twitter is often used to just passively consume posts. And so I've got nothing at the moment I'm going to tell you about that. That's a whole job of research in its own right. So very, very circumscribed, in actual fact, what I'm talking about. And when you start to open the can and peer into these kinds of things, very often you find that that's the case, that actually you have to get to the point where you have something meaningful to say. In this case, it's very much about exchanges, interactional exchanges on Twitter, and that's what I'm talking about. Why Twitter? Well, obviously it was given to me as a problem from the project, quite simply, and Twitter was seen as a prime vector for dissemination rumours. I could have started anywhere with any microblogs, really, but Twitter was the one that was given to me, so that's the one I worked on. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to examine a little bit how Twitter works as a turn-taking system. Now, what I did when I first actually started to examine Twitter, I sat down in a hotel room and actually looked at Twitter. I can actually remember doing this and looking at Twitter as an organisational phenomenon and thinking about, so what am I going to say about this? How is this actually organised when you look at it? And I started to pull out some bits and pieces of features and started to write them down. And as I started to write down the things I was seeing about how Twitter was organised, it started to look more and more like that, in actual fact. Which is a very seminal paper in the conversation analytic literature, which basically describes how conversation is organised as a turn-taking system. And it's an extremely good paper. But I found that when I was looking at the stuff on Twitter, I was finding a lot of phenomena that kind of was speaking about how Twitter was organised as a turn-taking system. And so that's why I wanted to understand what makes Twitter work as a turn-taking system. And in particular, what ways does it work that's different to that? Because I didn't want to take for granted that we're talking about Twitter as a conversation here. I wanted to understand Twitter in its own right. So how did it reflect what's happening in the simplest systematics, and how does it not? Now, the simplest systematics, just to give you a little bit of a flavour of this, because I don't know how many people in the room will have any knowledge of this particular text at all. What it basically does is it starts from first principles of conversation. It looks at how conversation is organised, and it examines certain features in fairly close detail. So one of the first observations, preliminary observation, is that people take turns when they're talking. And they take turns in talking for a very simple reason, that if everybody talks at once, it would be absolute bloody chaos and nobody would understand one another. So it makes perfect sense to have a system where you take turns in conversation. And then when you look at conversation, as they did in very close detail, you start to see that when you have a turn-taking system of that order, certain things have to ramify. So you have to decide whose turn it is next. And you have to have some kind of systematic way of providing whose turn it is, and how long a turn's going to take, and how a turn's going to get closed down and begun by other people. And all these things kind of fall out of this once you start to open that particular thing and explore it in a little bit more detail. And this is what Sachs and Shegloff and Jefferson did in extreme detail, as they worked through conversation, trying to examine all of those features and those organisational phenomena and the way it works. Now, I wanted to see if I could say something about Twitter in similar terms. With a preliminary glance at it, I was already moving in that direction, so I wanted to see if I could actually explore it in a more thoroughgoing way. Now, let's first of all say, is Twitter the same as conversation at the end of the day? Are the conversationalists right to actually analyse it in that way? What's the risk? No, it's Twitter. It's different. There are all sorts of organisational phenomena here that are quite distinct and different. And so if you call it conversation and you try to analyse it using the conventional conversation analytic apparatus, you're going to present yourself with a whole bunch of problems. But of course, many people do actually see it that way. A lot of literature out there that actually talks about Twitter actually do construe Twitter to be conversational in some sense. And I view that as in some ways problematic. And of course, even Twitter itself, when you look at Twitter pages, when it collects together interactions on a particular topic in response to a particular tweet, calls them conversations. So even Twitter uses the term. So what I want to do is to talk about some various features that both I noticed and that also relate to the simplest systematics conversation by Sachs. And to just talk about a few of these things and how they relate to things that you find in numerous different types of turn-taking systems, and how some of these things are quite specific to Twitter. So, first of all, talking about turn change. Now, clearly, one of the things that you've got to have with a turn-taking system of any kind is that you have to have change. It has to be distributed amongst participants. This is not a monologue. It's not somebody just talking and talking and talking and talking with nobody else joining in. There's an exchange going on here. So turns have to change in some way. In conversation, that's organised in a certain way, which we'll get onto in a moment, and there's very close controls over how that's distributed amongst the different participants. But in Twitter, of course, the dynamic of this is fundamentally organised around follower and followed relationships. And so people who are being followed will post a tweet, and then their followers will be able to respond to that tweet, post tweets, and other followers who are following them will then be able to respond to those tweets if they choose to do so. So the organisation is through this particular mechanism of followers and followed. Now, let's talk about turn overlap and turn separation. Now, one of the key things that comes out of the simplest systematics when Sachs and Shegloff and Jefferson write about it is that they see within the organisation of face-to-face conversation all sorts of phenomena that relate to handling very closely the fact that there are no significant gaps in the interaction, but at the same point in time, no significant overlaps in the interaction. So one person gets to talk, they get their turn, and then somebody else talks, and you don't have long periods of silence in between, or if you do, it becomes problematic. And there are systematic ways also within conversation for how that's handled too. And so you have this very focused concern upon turn overlaps and turn separation. Now, there are no visible turn overlaps in Twitter. This is, of course, a technical consequence of the way that it actually works and the way that you have a tweet stream laid out. So all turns, when you look at Twitter as a phenomena, as a recipient of tweets, appear to be independent and consecutive. And, of course, distributed text-based systems all have this kind of characteristic about them when you look at them. So this is something that you can say about the numerous types of microblogs. This isn't even just specific to just Twitter. They tend to have this particular characteristic. Now, I said a little bit about gap management already, and how conversational co-present interaction is organised in order to manage gaps very closely and to minimise gaps between turns. And, of course, I've just said that when Twitter, what you find is the structure allows there to be no visible overlaps or gaps between any of the tweets that appear. So you have a layout of tweets that go one after another independently, and you see them laid out that way in the tweet stream, and there are no apparent gaps within the interaction. But now, if you actually expect specific courses of interaction and specific conversations that are unfolding on Twitter, what you find is that there's actually sometimes significant temporal disjunctures. You find that there are, in actual fact, gaps in the interaction between people. And these can be gaps that even may last for hours, occasionally even days. But none of that is visible within Twitter as you receive it as an organisational phenomena. What you see is a continuous stream of tweets. There's no ongoing indication of turn construction happening within Twitter. All you see is one tweet after another tweet after another tweet. And of course, when you're actually tweeting, as somebody who's actually engaged in the business of tweeting, you can be doing a whole bunch of other things at the same point in time. And you're only tweeting as one of the things that you're engaged in. And so it's also broken up temporally in that particular respect as well. So it's a very fragmented kind of interaction. And, of course, the turn delay itself does not make itself manifest in Twitter. You see that there are gaps in interaction if you bother to explore a particular conversation, but all you see when you actually just consume the tweet stream is one tweet after another tweet after another tweet. And what you find is that turn delay, even though it's oriented to as massively problematic in face-to-face conversation, is not treated as at all problematic when you're doing tweeting. Nobody cares about the fact that it might take you several hours to respond. Nobody calls you to account for that. Now, I'm going to move on because I'm running out of time already, and I knew this would happen. There's something I want to point you to in particular with regard to this. There's various features that you'll find in the paper that work through various types of organisational phenomena of Twitter and how it works as a turn-taking system that both relate to conversation, co-present conversation, and don't. And there are numerous ways in which I point to how it is really quite distinct as a phenomena. You have to read the paper to find out, I'm afraid, because I'm almost out of time. But there's one thing I did want to get to, which is this particular little quote here. Because if you remember right back at the beginning, I said I was engaged in a project that was focused on rumour. And all the point of this, of course, was to actually try and provide some insights for people who are trying to design systems that could do something to do with rumorous interactions on Twitter. And so here is a key point here with regard to how conversation is organised that Sachs and Shegloff made, and that turns out to also be extremely pertinent for how Twitter is organised. And basically what they say is that when people are engaged in conversation, they use the ongoing turn as a resource to be able to analyse the previous turn, and then will produce a response in turn to that in the next turn that they engage in. So you have a three-part structure in any conversational interaction, where one turn's analysing the prior one, and the next turn is moving on to the next one. So this three-part structure is absolutely integral to the way conversation works. And when you look at Twitter, you actually find exactly the same thing. So when you want to talk about rumours, when you want to discuss how rumours are organised on Twitter, one key point that I want to make is that, skipping on down to the end, a freestanding tweet is not a rumour. One tweet on its own does not make a rumour. And there is an awful lot of analysis out there that says that that is exactly what happens. And of course, it takes several people working together to make a rumour a rumour. And so this mapping out of how one turn builds on another and becomes an analytic resource for somebody else is the way that rumour propagation actually begins to unfold on Twitter when you actually look at it. So I've got no more time to tell you any more. I do within the paper, of course, work through some examples about more than just that one insight. But that's, of course, a key insight with regard to how rumour propagation might happen on something like Twitter. Okay, thank you.
Hey there, thank you. One thing I was thinking about in your talk, and it's often forgotten about when people talk about turn-taking, this turn-taking system, is projectability. So the fact that in spoken conversations, the end of a turn is projected through the linguistic
exactly
design.
So, yes, and of course you don't get that in Twitter in the same way. Yeah.
Sorry?
That doesn't happen in Twitter in the same way.
No, that doesn't happen. So yeah, so that's worth highlighting.
Yeah.
The other thing is teasing apart conversation, turn-taking, and sequence. There seem to be different things in here.
Oh, yes, yeah. Much of which is actually explicated within the paper. I mean, I gave you a huge gloss here.
Because a conversation can be a conversation without actually complying to turn-taking.
Yeah. Because there is a danger here, of course, of then taking what I'm saying here as in turn just another reworking of conversation analytic apparatus and saying this is just conversation again. And what I'm trying to do when I'm talking about this is to make clear distance between Twitter as a phenomena and conversation as a phenomena. They are not the same thing ultimately.
Thank you.
Is there time for one more? Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. So you mentioned that you find treating Twitter as conversation problematic. Treating Twitter as a conversation, Twitter exchanges as conversation problematic.
Yes.
In that sense, I was wondering what you think about the practice in most social media analysis of essentially using individual tweet or individual post as the unit of analysis around which everything revolves.
Again, very proper. Let's be clear, you have to talk about what kind of analysis are you engaged in here, because some kinds of analysis, of course, if you're engaged in linguistics and you're wanting to understand something very specific about how particular words are used, that might well be a very interesting thing to do. But if you're talking about tweets as a resource for social interaction, then I think that becomes problematic. If you focus on a tweet in isolation in that way without seeing how it's contextually produced.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, of course, I've not even mentioned here, and which I know that Barry has written about previously, is the fact that, of course, tweets are produced in actual particular situated circumstances. And I haven't even begun to talk about that, and how people are actually sitting there and composing tweets in certain social circumstances, and how all of that might unfold. And, of course, some of what Moira was saying earlier also relates to that too.